Welcome everybody to our weekly Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are on Acharei Mot. That is this week's Torah portion is Acharei Mot, which is right in the middle of the book of Leviticus. And so I pointed out last year when we had Acharei Mot and Kedoshim together, but now we can focus on Acharei Mot alone. So Acharei Mot has a few chapters. One of those chapters is what I like to consider the middlemost chapter of the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. Now, I do have to point out, it might not literally be like by numbers the middlemost chapter, but it is thematically, by theme, it is the middlemost chapter. It is, I mentioned in this space last year that the book of Leviticus has kind of like this is a fancy term, chiastic structure. So it's kind of like an X. So it's kind of like if we were to think about a poem, if we were to say an ABCBA poem, or more simply an ABA poem, ABCBA poem, or more dramatically, maybe an ABCDCBA poem. So basically you have something and then everything else reflects something previously. So with chapter 19, I said the thematically most central most. So if we look outward, chapters 18 and 20 are fairly mirror each other to a large degree, and then more outwardly from there. So 17 and 21, and then so on and so forth. What makes this really particularly fascinating, not only being the middlemost thematic chapter in the book of Leviticus, but also when we consider that Leviticus is the middlemost book of the Torah. So this would be not only this is the middlemost chapter of the entire Torah, if we wanted to be fairly, if we wanted to be fairly engaging and hyperbole about it. So there's a lot. And what I mentioned last year, so in last year when we did the Village Torah for it, I did an overview of chapter 19. And in that overview, I mentioned there is a lot going on in this Torah portion. In just chapter 19, forget that there's a lot going on in the Torah portion, but specific to chapter 19, there's a lot. I consider it a potpourri of practices, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's various agricultural practices, whether it's not placing a stumbling block before the blind, whether it's there's lots and lots and lots. That's an overview. Embedded within this chapter, amongst this potpourri of dozens and dozens of different mitzvot, of practices, and so on, we have a very particular line that is very appropriate for Cedar Village. And so I'm going to bring it up on screen, what I have in mind. So I mentioned we are in chapter 19. So we have verse 32, which is, "You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord." So this is an interesting verse. As you can tell, this is something that is very appropriate for our populace, for our demographic here. And really, if we could break it out into really three components here. Ooh, and I can be fancy because I can draw. So we have sort of the first one here's the first one. Clearly, I am not an artist. I am not a visual graphic designer. So my drawing skills are certainly leaving much to be desired. But this is the first component. We'll just have a number one here. We'll have a second part here. And I'll make, I'm going to also do corresponding here in the English. This is number one. This is number two. And then we have a third part with my excellent writing. Okay. So I do not claim to be an artist. Just because I use colors does not make me an artist. Okay. So the first part in Hebrew is 3 words, which is Mipnei Seva Takum. And it's really interesting. If we were to break this down, I would say in front of, so here you know what? Actually, what we're going to do is I want to kind of use the text. Ooh, let's see this. All right. So you shall, this now we're not relying on my drawing skills anymore. Before the aged, you shall show deference to the old. Okay. And we'll expand it. Okay. So now we can see this a little bit more clearly. Okay. All right. So we have these first two components. I mentioned we have three. The first two are the action, or if we want to be very specific, the mitzvot. And it kind of is two separate commandments here. If we really want to think about it, there are two separate commandments. The first of which is rising before the aged, mipnei seva. So in front of mipnei seva, it's an old person. Takum, you shall rise. And then we have the second one, which is very strikingly similar to the first one. You shall show deference to the old. I will say there's some interesting, with any translation, there's something that gets lost. So the first one, it actually, this translation doesn't have this, but the first word is mipnei. From the, I would extremely literally translate this as from the face of. So if you are in the face of, or you're somehow facing an aged person, the mitzvah is to rise, is to stand up. The second one, vahadarta, show deference. It's not really, you can show deference, but very literally, hadar almost has this sense of beauty. It's, I would say almost beautify or glorify to the old. Okay, Pnei Zaken, the face of the elderly. So somehow there certainly is a level of deference, but I would say it almost has an element of glorifying or beautifying the face of the old. So, but one other thing that I do want to point out is going back to what I was mentioning. Is we have draw. Okay. Do I have? I don't even know what I can do. But the aged and the old are kind of the same word. They parallel each other. So aged, old, seva, and so that's very similar. Rise and show deference. Okay, so those are similar things. Now I do want to point out. So those are the mitzvah components, and we're going to go into them a little bit further. But there's this third aspect. We're not really going to go so deeply into it, but I do want to point this out as part of this verse. So in the Hebrew, it's v'yareta melohecha ani Adonai, and you shall fear from the Lord. I am God. I am the Lord. Or you shall fear from God, your God. I am the Lord. Now, it's interesting. I'm just going to point this out just as a fun little fact. This is a commonly recurring phrase in this chapter. I counted it up. Not necessarily the fearing from your God, but I am the Lord appears either I am the Lord, or I am the Lord your God 15 times throughout this chapter. And we're already in the 32nd verse, but there's not many more verses throughout the rest of the chapter. So sometimes it appears every single verse, sometimes every other verse. It's a frequently occurring refrain, if we want to use such language. It's a commonly recurring refrain of I am the Lord, or I am the Lord your God. This is a very big component throughout this chapter. If we just want to think about the literary context, that God self-identifying that he is the Lord, he is God, is certainly an important component, even if just from a literary standpoint, but clearly also something more as well. Now that we have that, so we have, just so we have the sense of, there are three components if we want to really break down this verse that is clearly very relevant to where we are. The first of which is rising before the aged. Second one is whether it's showing deference to the old, which is a translation I think loses some aspect of what's really going on, but maybe glorifying or otherwise beautifying the faces of the aged, and fearing from your God. Okay, so those are the three. What I want to do now that we've hopefully this will start to percolate and simmer in people's heads of thinking about what's going on here, and this is, and by the way, I would say this is the central most, certainly articulation, but the central most mitzvah when it comes to thinking about how, or just any mitzvah, any commandment when as it relates to thinking about our demographic here at Cedar Village. Okay, so I want to, I know that oftentimes what we talk about in here is midrashim. So what we're going to be looking at is technically a midrash of some sort, but really a sort of more of a halachic midrash or of a practical midrash. So we're going to be primarily looking at one text, but we're going to have a sort of a secondary set of texts as well as we explore how are we actually supposed to perform this commandment or these commandments or the mitzvot embedded within this verse. So we're going to be looking at this text from the Babylonian Talmud, and it's found on Kedoshim 32b. So I have also taken the liberty of sort of breaking down this text, and as I've broken it down, it could probably be broken down even further, but I've broken it down into 9 separate components, although it is actually one sort of compound text as a sort. Okay, so the sages taught with regard to the verse, Mipnei seva takum, before the hoary head you shall stand. So one might have thought, I didn't really care for this breakdown, but okay. One might have thought that it is obligatory to stand before a simple elder, sort of a not smart person. Therefore, the verse states an elder, and an elder is nothing other than a wise person. So when it says as zakin, as it is stated, gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel. So meaning only people who are wise. So it works better in Hebrew. Zakin, who is a zakin? Someone who is a chacham, someone who is knowledgeable, someone who is wise. And clearly from this statement, it would seem, actually it gets more articulated here in the next component. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, who I think people might remember him from the Passover Agada, he says, a zaken, what is this, elder? It's nothing other than one who has acquired wisdom. As it is stated, the Lord acquired me, Kanani. I think he's playing off the sort of, it sounds similar, zaken, Kanani, so at the beginning of his way. So clearly we have at the very outset, and I just want to warn everybody, this text isn't over. There's still, and the rabbis are prone to disagreement, so stay tuned. But clearly what's going on here is at the outset, we're not supposed to rise before, we're not expected to rise before an elder who is not wise. And clearly, who is someone who is wise? Someone who has acquired wisdom. And clearly, from Rabbi Yossi, the Galilean's perspective, why even bother? What's the point in giving such deference or honor and rising before an elder? Well, clearly, only someone who is wise, because that's the whole, almost, that's the apex of growing old. Of why should someone give honor to the elderly? Because they have lived a long life and acquired a lot of wisdom along the way. But if they have not acquired wisdom along the way, they don't fit into that category, according to Rabbi Yossi the Galilean. Okay, but we're not done yet. Okay, so now we're going to see 5 anonymous statements before we get to 2 final named statements. Okay, so the first of these 5 is, one might have thought that one must stand before an elder even from a distance. Therefore, the verse states, you shall stand and you shall revere. I said standing only in a place where there is reverence. So if you're standing from a far distance, I would say a non-elder standing a far distance away from an elder, do they even, does that even register? So clearly it has to be within enough geographical proximity that at least there would be sort of a reverence acknowledged. So that's the first of these 5 anonymous components. Next one might have thought that one should revere this person through an elder person with money. The verse states, you shall stand and you shall revere. Just as standing includes no monetary loss, so too reverence includes no monetary loss. So it's not saying that younger people should not spend money on older people. It's simply saying that's not what this is talking about, meaning that could be a whole other conversation. But here, at the very least, it's something that even people without any money are able to accomplish. They're able to stand. They're able to revere the elderly. Okay, the next one is, one might have thought one should stand before an elderly person in the lavatory or in the bathhouse, in the bathroom or the bathhouse. The verse states, you shall stand and you shall revere. Only this standing is only in a place where there is reverence, meaning in a bathroom, in a bathhouse, there's not necessarily reverence. It's not the same type of sort of a social structure, so to speak. Okay, the next one. So this is the final anonymous component. One might have thought that one could close one's eyes so that they do not see the elder. The verse states, you shall stand and you shall fear. With regard to any matter given over to the heart, it is stated, and you shall fear your God. So this third component of the verse I pointed out at the outset, that has a function here. And okay, just because you don't see this person, so you might say, oh, well, they're not within, they're not close enough for me to see them. I don't have to stand. No, there's still this having an awe of God component, and therefore that sort of overrules that. You can't just close your eyes and say, I don't see an old person in front of me. Someone is still obligated to rise even so. Okay. Now we have 2 final statements, both of which have have names attached to them. So the first of these is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, from where is it that an elder should not trouble others to honor that elder? The verse states, an elder you shall fear. So that's a really interesting statement by Rabbi Shimon, son of Elazar. That's actually that's a statement that I'm very curious about exploring further. I haven't looked into that. I'm not really. I think the whole point is, I think there's an expectation people should be honoring their elders, and it shouldn't have to be upon the elder to remind a younger person, you need to honor me. I think that, but I could look into that further. But this is the kicker. This is the important part. The final component of this entire text we've been reading so far, Issi ben Yehuda. So if you notice something, he's not a rabbi. He has a name, but he doesn't have the title rabbi. We've heard from a couple rabbis already, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, and just now Rabbi Shimon, son of Elazar. But now we have Issi ben Yehuda, Issi the son of Yehuda, not a rabbi, just a guy. He says, Mipnei seva takum, in front of the aged you shall stand, even anybody whose aged is included. So he is now disagreeing with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who was at the outset of sort of the beginning, saying, only if you're wise do people have to rise before you. He says, no, anybody who's made it, anybody who's attained that age is included within the mitzvah of people having to stand in front of them. So just to go through a brief summary, we're not done, but a brief summary of this massive text that we've just explored, looking at how did the early rabbis, and just to give you a historical context, we're really talking about the first couple of centuries from the Common Era. So really, and these so basically late first throughout the second century of the Common Era, just to give you a sense of how far back this text is from. And so we do start off with who is to be honored. Now, we don't have, one of the really fascinating aspects of this is that we don't have a minimum age. What's the minimum age that people should be honoring, that people should be rising for? We don't have that. That's not included here. That seems to be just simply, I don't know. older people, I guess the rabbis here are saying older people. I'm not saying that there isn't a text that deals with that, but I'm saying for this major text that deals with it, we don't see it. But the main question from the beginning and the end is, how elitist is this? Why are we rising? Are we rising because the whole point of honoring elderly is because they've accumulated a lot of wisdom and knowledge throughout all their decades. So if someone's not wise, if someone's not smart, you don't need to honor them. Issi ben Yehuda, a non-rabbi, at the very end says, you know what? No, I know I'm not a rabbi, but there's something, even for people who've not accumulated a lot of wisdom, even if they're not wise, they should still be given deference. People should still rise for them as well. There's a lot of other components we saw when certain circumstances, also people not closing their eyes. So all those things are important. So now we want to have a follow-up sort of selection of texts a little bit later. The first of which is we have a statement, Rabbi Yochanan. So he is the early 3rd century of the Common Era. He says the halacha, or the sort of the normative Jewish practice, accords with Issi ben Yehuda. We had Rabbi Yossi the Galilean say, no, we got to be elitist. Issi ben Yehuda says, no, we have to rise and show deference to all elderly. Rabbi Yochanan here says, we're doing that. We're not going to be elitist. We're going to show deference to all old people. Okay, so now we have something, a little bit of a sort of a giving a little color to this by Rabbi Yochanan himself. So it says, Rabbi Yochanan himself would stand before Aramaean elders, Gentile elders. And he says, how many experiences have occurred to these individuals? So he's now articulating, obviously, again, not the elitist component, you don't need to be wise, should be for everybody. And he says it's not even just exclusive to Jews. This is not an internal giving respect, rising before just Jewish elders, but even anybody elderly. And it's not, and he also, because he's not going with the need for wisdom, right? So he's not going for the elitist aspect. What else could it be driven by? And now he's saying they've had a lot of experiences. They've dealt with a lot of stuff throughout the course of their lives. They've endured to this point. We're going to rise out of respect, honor. They've endured all of this. Now we're going to see a couple instances from some later rabbis, some about end of the 3rd, early 4th century rabbis. Rava would not stand before them, but he displayed reverence to them. So he wouldn't rise. So Rava is this early 4th century rabbi, one of the most significant rabbis throughout the entire Talmud. And he wouldn't stand in front of Gentile elders, but he did display reverence to them. So he still had this aspect that he would do. Abaye, who was a contemporary of Rava, would extend a hand to elders so that they could lead on him. And Rava would send his agent to help them. Okay. And Rav Nachman would send officers, his servants, to assist elders. So even if they were busy, they weren't able to physically be there, but they would still send others to be able to accomplish these mitzvot sort of on their behalf. There's a lot more we could go into in this topic. There are other rabbinic conversations just in the Talmudic era about this particular mitzvah or mitzvot, multiple mitzvot here, but specifically this verse. There are certainly others, but within these narrow parameters, it is really fascinating that there are certainly 2 choices that the rabbis made. One, when we're thinking about how do we orient ourselves towards elders, the first of which is actually in just thinking about the biblical verses, there's this notion of rising, so rising out of respect, and also showing a certain deference, an honor given to elders. And the 2 choices, one of which is it only the elders that have acquired a lot of wisdom, and the rabbis basically said, no, we do not need to be elitist about this. We're going to show deference and rise before all aged. And not only that, furthermore, it's even for, and although we saw there's a little bit of a disagreement amongst rabbis as to what they would do, Rava would not rise before Gentile elders, but he would show deference. Rabbi Yochanan even would rise in front of even Gentile elders. So there's certainly this more democratizing move amongst the rabbis of the Talmud in regard to these mitzvot. One other thing I want to throw in, if anybody has been in Israel, on buses there, it has literally the first three words of this biblical verse. It has these three words, like in a sticker towards the front of the bus. It'll say, Mitnei Seva Takum. You should stand up for elders. Let the elders sit. You can stand. So that's a lovely way that we've seen this biblical verse in present day Israel being put into practice. So I hope this was certainly helpful. I don't know how well known this verse is, but I would say this is the central verse as it relates to elderly. How does Judaism regard and otherwise relate to the elderly in Judaism? There should be respect. People should rise in front of the aged. And that is, I would say, this is the central verse for us, and certainly thinking about and orienting ourselves to this.
This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh, and I was really thrilled to hear that it was respected in Israel as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is excellent, excellent, excellent. I hope that people here get the message.
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you did a wonderful job in explanation.
Oh, I appreciate
Truly
it.
enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
This is one of the best we've had.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you.
It really is. I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad I didn't miss it.
Yes.
Yes, that's for sure.
Yes. So
well, thank you, sir.
My pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed.
Oh, I did. Very, very much.
All right. Great.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and watching this Village Torah presentation. Before we go, I just want to acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Cedar Village are thanks to the financial and moral support of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. So thank you. And with that, I want to say thank you so much and Shabbat Shalom.